All right, hey, welcome back, guys. My name is Matthew. This is the Yoga Couple channel. If you haven't subscribed already, go ahead and do so. We're going to be covering tons of cool topics about self-realization, yoga, and kind of the yoga philosophy especially. And with that, we're going to talk about today is, what is the ego? So this is a super common term that you're going to hear in yoga and in spiritual circles. We're always hearing this term, ego, ego. Now, I was trained in psychology, and in psychology it kind of has a slightly different meaning as derived from, say, Carl Jung and Freud. And when we think about it in a spiritual sense, what we're really talking about is essentially we are trying to separate our spiritual essence or our consciousness or our soul from the more body attachment sense of self. So in the broadest sense, the ego is our sense of self. Now, that sense of self, though, is kind of changing all the time. And in psychology, this is a balance between our superconscious, like our superego, this is our conscience. And then we have our id, which is like our carnal drives. And this is this balance. The ego is the balance between being super Puritan, and then like really, really carnal. And in terms of our sense of self, though, is essentially that compilation of who do we really think we are? We are a combination of all of our belief systems and any programs that we've been given. So let's think about the ego as our sense of self. Now, the most basic sense of self that we would start with is our body and its emotions. So the first sense of self is, I am this body, I am this name even perhaps, right? I am this vessel. I'm the emotions that come with it. So when anger arises, I am anger. Like people say, I am angry, I am happy. I see how they're identifying who they are with the emotions. Or I am hurt, like if the body gets cut or hurt or something, they're like, I am hurt. So you'll notice that it's all very subtle in our language. We even identify our ego through our language all the time. If you listen carefully, you can see how we do this all the time. And maybe it'll start to jump out to you now. So the first identification is with the body. This is natural, this is nature, this is what would make sense. Biologically, it is important for anything conscious to identify with its body, otherwise it will die. So the ego needs to identify with the body first, otherwise there will be no desire to seek survival. So next up is, once we can assume survival has been achieved and there is a sense of comfort with the body, now the ego can move into a, shall we say, like more evolved sense, or a little more abstract, and that would move into the thinking mind. Now, the thinking mind self is, we are the thoughts. The ego as thoughts is the mind. And this is what in yoga we talk about a lot. This is the most common sense of ego that most people are talking about. Most people can get with the fact that we are not the body. We can usually understand the idea that we have a body and we are not the body, because we all tend to notice this separation. There seems to be something beyond, right? Like something within this body that's like not necessarily it, but it's observing it. It's like intimately connected and woven into it, right? And when we talk about the ego as the mind, this is what we typically are referring to. This is what most spiritual texts in yoga is referring to, is the ego as mind. Now, the ego as mind is the thinker. And as the thinker, there is a constant obsession with my thoughts. Don't bother me, I'm thinking, right? Like there is a glorification of thoughts because thoughts are me. And another way you'll notice people really claiming attachment to the ego as mind is when they're really excited about their thoughts, or when they are attached to their thoughts. That was my idea, or something like this. So when people are really associated with their mind as thinker, this becomes a level of ego attachment as the thinker, as the mind. So these are the most basics, right? We have kind of like a tier system. Body, its emotions. We have the mind as thinker. There is then another level of, you can think of as the spiritual ego, and this is the ego as soul, or as this identity as a soul or spirit that is still like special in me. It still has an attachment to it, because when we talk about transcendence of ego, which we'll get to a little later, there is even a realization beyond that, that is not personal. So with that being said, we could even clarify the ego to be, again, kind of going back to what I said, this personal self, this sense of self, but it's personal. There's a me, there's an I attached to it. So it's the sense of me, the sense of I. And where we are in this perspective, where we are in this attachment cycle, shall we say, where we identify is really important to understand, because where you identify the ego is, or me, where you identify you as being me, or what you would think of when you say I, what are you referring to? It's important to know and really think about this. If you haven't ever thought about it, this would be a good thing to think about, because this gives us the foundation of where to move next. If we are still associating with the body, there's no point in talking about ego as mind. If you're still associating with the body as, still associating the ego with the mind, there's no point in talking about the soul yet, because there's going to be too much interest in the mind. So there needs to be understanding of where everyone is. This is why most spiritual teachings say that truth needs to be taught in relativity to the student. That means that not everyone is ready for the same amount of truth. And ironically, one truth at one level, at another level, is not true anymore. So it's kind of a wonky world, right? Like, how could that be true then, but it's not true now? It's because truth is relative in a lot of ways. We can look for absolutes, but absolutes only will make sense from a certain perspective. So even the absolute can be relative if you look at it in the sense of what is true for the person. What is true for each of us is different. It's relative. So that is why, some people have said there is no right and wrong, because from everyone's perspective, technically, in their world, in their paradigm, they feel completely right. The ego feels completely justified. It feels completely just instilled within its own paradigm. Because to go against it would be to deny its own existence. It would be to go against its own life, right? Okay, so we have the ego as sense of self, body, mind, spirit. And we could go beyond that, and the path of transcendence is to let go of all those attachments. What is beyond all sense of a personal me? What is this radical sense of infinite I, or this infinite beyond I? It's like radical subjectivity, I like to think of it. That's how my teacher puts it, is just radically subjective. Nothing else. There's nothing even possible to be added. It's just the very blank, infinite possibilities of experience. It has nothing that needs to be added to it. It is infinite in possibility. In quantum physics, we refer to this as that infinite field. That is us. What if that consciousness, that pureness of untouched, beyond and before the personal self drops in? This is what transcendence is referring to. So let's talk about how to get there. Attachments begin because when we sense that something is me, or we think it's I, we therefore want to protect and defend it at any cost necessary. So this is why it's important to know where you really feel your ego, or where you feel your sense of self resides. If you are trying to help someone who's really attached to their body, trying to help them with meditations of the mind will be irrelevant. What you have to help them see is that the body is not who they really are. This takes time and takes a matter of helping them. Usually the easiest way is to transcend the emotions, or in other words, to see that you are not your emotions. You have the ability to be beyond the emotions. And in another video, Ash and I talked about how when we are very reactive, we are run by our emotions. So it was in our self-awareness video. We discussed what is it to be self-aware, because to be self-aware is to begin this whole journey of finding out what is beyond my current state of thinking. So in the beginning, we are run by our emotions. I remember as a child, I just react. I still have tendencies here and there where I'll just start reacting, but then I have to stop myself. But when you're a child especially, your ego's just forming, and so you're very reactive. Someone takes something from you that you thought was mine, right? And you're like, and they throw tantrums, or they get mad, or they're like confused, or they cry, right? Because a sense of me was taken. I think that I can be taken, right? I think that me can be broken apart and taken. Now, another interesting thing is the physical. People who have often had limbs amputated or have been in traumatic experiences, they notice that the me, or their sense of self, has not changed, right? So this can be a radical transformation for these people, because they have this really interesting epiphany that the rest of us have a hard time relating to on such an extreme level. They realize that I am still me. Just because my arm or my leg or something was removed doesn't change. It was the body's leg or arm, but I am still me, and therefore I must be beyond it. I must be beyond the physical body. Now this is noticeable with less extreme things too, such as injuries, like we mentioned earlier, a cut, or sicknesses, things like that. We start to realize that I am beyond the body, and even though the body is going through something, I seem to be separate from it, experiencing it. Does this make sense? And this kind of leads us into, I seem to be the thinker of it. I seem to have thoughts about what's going on with the body. Okay, so ego as body is this sense of really reactive and connected to the emotions. Now, this is the beginning stages, and how to get out of this is to learn how to become self-aware. To learn how, as the body changes, you seem to stay the same. Or in other words, your sense of identity tends to continue on. The best way to do this is to reflect on just time. Notice how as life has gone on, this sense of self has seemed to be the same. You change your clothes and you don't seem to change as a person. The body just looks different. You cut your hair, you change something about the body. You don't necessarily change. Okay, if you really think about it, you'll notice you don't change. You just perceive things differently from this new vessel that you've created or changed. Okay, so emotions then are the more difficult ones to release attachment to. When we have emotions, we think that is real. We think it's who I am. If anger is arising or happiness is arising, it must be me. It must be my reality. It must be true. But it's not. It's just an option. So emotions can be transcended by going beyond them through self-awareness, by drawing attention that just because I'm sensing an emotion does not mean I have to become the emotion. This is the first level of transcending emotions and body as ego. Next becomes the thinker, because to transcend emotions, you as a mind have to see them. There is anger arising, but I do not have to choose it. Thus, I have moved into this other realm of thinker. I am a mind or an energy, an essence that can observe the body separate from it. Now I have separated myself. I have moved into a different realm where it's no longer reactionary. It's no longer happening without my thinking involved. Now I've become more aware in that I value my thoughts more than anything, because thoughts now seem to have more power, because thoughts have now become the sense of choice. You see, you can almost think of the ego as a sense of choice as well. The choice lies in the body. If the body feels an urge, it does it. Therefore, I do it. If the body's hungry, I eat. If the body is tired, it sleeps. You see what I'm saying? This is ego as body. It's running off of urges. Ego as thinker takes a new level of self-control. Now, only what happens is what you think is a good choice or a relevant choice. This is now allowing us to suspend urges and allows us to not be as reactionary. We have begun the process of separating in that I am separate from the body. Because I'm separate from the body, I can think about it. Well, once I start to think about it, I realize that I hold a whole reservation of thoughts about who I am and what the body means to me. And so this is the bulk of most inner work. Most inner work comes from working on the ego as mind because it is loaded. It's huge, all right? The ego as mind is all of our belief systems, all of our programming from society and our parents, all of our own internal values and likes and dislikes, all of our judgments, our morals, our ethics, all of our more abstract perspectives of life, all of our perceptions, and again, just think of every value judgment you have, it's all in your mind, okay? None of those actually exist. They're actually just thoughts. They are choices that occurred because they came into your path and you agreed to them. This is the interesting thing about belief systems. And when I was a school teacher, belief systems were very fascinating to me because everything I had learned in school studying psychology had taught me that if you can control belief systems, you can control a destiny. Because belief systems have the power to inhibit and limit, or they have the ability to create endless or boundless experiences, and they have the ability to liberate. Belief systems are very powerful, and we have to understand them in order to really make any genuine progress towards fulfillment and genuine happiness. Now, belief systems are the root and fundamental sense of self and where all the thoughts stem from. Our governing belief systems are what hold our reality together. The thoughts that come from them are all products of the belief systems or of our governing sense of self. So, for example, if your belief system, you've been ingrained to believe that you are of less worth, you are not very intelligent, and that you probably are not going to do much in life. Your thoughts will all be in agreement with that. There will be times when they will be different. Like, say, for example, you'll be around an inspiring situation and you might think, wow, maybe I am capable of more. But if it's too far out of range, your belief system, governing belief system, will reject the thought and say, oh, that's silly thinking. Who am I kidding? Right? And then we keep ourselves back into our trap. This then leads us to take certain jobs. It leads us to reach for certain goals. It governs all of our interactions with people. We are constantly telling the world who we are through our actions and behaviors. So how we behave in every instant is eliciting to the world who I am. And if we have a governing belief system of lack and of not much value, then we will behave in such a way that will elicit that to others. We will not try for very much. Does this make sense? Now, in children, this is so fun and transparent. Not that that belief system was fun, but that you can see belief systems effortlessly. If you have your own kids, it's a very fascinating thing to look at because your children are behaving in a way that they were governed to behave or in that they were programmed to behave. They watch every single thing that the parents do or their environment does. It doesn't have to be parents per se. It could be the grandmother, the grandfather, or the brother, uncle, or sister, whoever they're around the most. And this is who they will continue to imitate. This is where all belief systems are being formed. It began in the womb. It begins in the womb with the mother and everything she's being exposed to. So as they are receiving exposure, the ego mind is formulating, this is the world. If you look at it from a biological standpoint, the ego is meant to survive. And this is going to be very important when we get closer to transcendence here in a minute. The ego is a system of survival. It was very useful, so there's no need to kill or fight or defeat the ego. That isn't going to get us anywhere. Trying to defeat the ego or kill the ego is irrelevant. The ego is a biological system of managing data in our external world to survive. Okay, you can almost think of it like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in that it seeks things in order of survival. And ironically, to even be interested in transcendence is only a desire of the privileged few who no longer have to worry about other lower base survival needs, such as food, water, and shelter, and feeling loved and having worth. If you do not have a sense of security, seeking transcendence is very irrelevant. You are like, what are you talking about yoga and trying to become transcendent or leaving attachments? I'm just trying to eat, or I'm just trying to find clean water or shelter today. Okay? Now, there are exceptions to this in, say, the Hindu culture, where an ascetic or a sage path is relevant. This is when it is purposeful and it is intended to prove the point that all shelter and security is only found in God, or in other words, in self-realization. This is a separate thing. But if we look at society as a whole, typically a person is not homeless because they're seeking transcendence, especially in the Western world. That is extremely rare, if hardly happens at all. I'm sure there's some very rare cases, but in our culture it's not relevant. In Eastern cultures, yes, there are plenty of monks and ascetics in Eastern cultures. Now, moving forward, so if we do not have these lower needs met, we can't possibly be curious about this. Now, back to children. If you observe these children, you will notice that they are living out the programming that we have given them. And this is when all interesting projection and repression begins. So we project onto our children and we repress as well. So we repress them, we repress ourselves as this projection repression goes back and forth. So when we see things that our children do that go against our belief systems, we quickly correct them, or we do something in a way to show them that that is not reality, or that is not a choice. That is within our paradigm. So we are actually creating paradigms. Dr. Bruce Lipton, it's epigenetics, a doctor of epigenetics, dealing with cells and their reaction to environment. And what he basically concluded is that parents are genetic, bioengineers, because they are telling the cells of the human what to expect of reality, what to expect of the world. This is extremely interesting and very important to realize, because what you see is that we actually have control over the very destiny of children and people, their health and their inheritance as to what is going to be possible for them. So on the flip side of my time as a teacher, while there is the beliefs of seeing children struggle, and when I looked at their family dynamics and I looked at the kids' self-esteem and what they believed of themselves, no matter what I could do to talk to them and try to help them change it, if they have a governing energy that is reinforcing their belief system, there's a eventual point where they have to decide. Now, on the other hand, there were so many children who had these really powerful belief systems that their parents instilled in them, that they had this abundance of good fortune, shall we say. They were raised knowing that their needs were always provided for, and because of that, it allowed them in Maslow's hierarchy of needs to jump to higher things. They are able to, at a younger age, start seeking out their destiny and purpose. They care less about what others think. They are able to seek higher abstract thinking because they are not still struggling with, do I even deserve to think about this? Do you see what I'm saying? Or do I even deserve to pursue such loftful goals? So children are very interesting because they're just so transparent. It's such an easy thing to observe all of these theories with, because they just don't have a filter yet. They don't have as many defense mechanisms either. They haven't learned to hide themselves socially. So they are just revealing exactly who they are in their programming at all times. It becomes very easy to just, you can kind of sum them up very quickly because it's so easy. Now, this doesn't technically go away. Most adults are actually just children in adult bodies. Emotionally and intellectually, they have still the similar brain of their childhood self. They have not transcended, say, certain emotions, and they're still having tantrums and addictions, right? These just take more adult forms, but they still exist in the same way. So adults, if you look at adults, you can identify their karmic patterns. This is one of the things that I find really interesting and seem to have a knack for doing. I love meeting and talking with people because I love to observe and study their paths, their thinking habits. What are their dominant thoughts? What are their Freudian slips, shall we say? This is when they constantly make subtle language choices that kind of reveal what they're truly thinking or what they truly are. So these subtle slips of the tongue reveal a lot about someone. You know, there's so many different ways that you can observe someone's karmic inheritance or their karmic path. It's in the body language, it's in the tone, it's in eye contact especially. A really fun and interesting experiment I learned in when I was studying to be a therapist was this great exercise where you have someone, your partner, look at you directly in the eye, and there's a couple ways you can do it. You can either say nothing and just stare, you could hold hands, you could sit across from each other, you could do all that kind of stuff that just basically changes the level of intensity. If you're going to be holding hands and looking into each other's eyes, it's going to increase the intensity. Another way you can do it is you can say what first comes to mind and then just keep going, like one word, you know, and this exchange just goes back and forth. But what is important about it is, as people evolve, they are able to hold eye contact for longer periods of time. Eventually, it can become essentially endless. So one thing that I used to pay attention to is, how do I hold eye contact with people? This would help me understand where I was having discomfort in my belief systems. Now, it would depend on the person I'm looking into, the eyes they're looking into, right? Because why am I pulling away? This is a really good tactic that you could use to kind of understand yourself more, is which people trigger me to look away more than others. When we are with a loving figure, it's a little easier. That's because that person does not need to look away. As we become more loving and understanding of ourselves, we therefore are more loving and understanding of others. And so we are therefore able to hold eye contact longer. All right, so we got all this cool stuff. So belief systems and thoughts. As our belief systems are formed, we then create a whole myriad of thought frequencies. Okay, you can think of it like a radio wave or a radio station. Our thoughts are all tuned to radio stations. Okay, and the radio station is what we believe is possible for ourselves. As we believe, we then start thinking. So if I believe that anything is possible, I therefore am allowing a larger frequency of positive thoughts to come to me, because I'm not limiting it by saying, oh, I could never do that. If I say I can never do that, then all thoughts that are for doing it are not going to probably come to me. Or if they do, like I said before, I might reject them. If I'm lucky, I'll get some bravery and I'll accept it and break out of my paradigm, as I saw some children do. It is possible, if they're exposed to a continuous positive influence, they can break free from a limiting one. This is why it's so important to have a teacher, and the importance of a guru. So the teacher helps us break out of our belief systems that we are ensnared by or that we are clinging to. Because that's what it really comes down to. Why can't we transcend negative belief systems? Why can't we let them go? The few things that I've observed is that the first thing is they're familiar. If our thoughts and sense of self is familiar, it's really hard to let go of, because that means we have to face the unknown. The unknown is of course frightening, because that's where all fear comes from. Fear is a product of the unknown. We do not know what is going to happen, and so we are afraid of it, even if it could be better. This is just the biological ego surviving, okay? Again, let's have compassion here. Hopefully this will help you see. It's not about defeating the ego, because the ego is doing this because for millions of years it helped us survive. How did it help us survive? By thinking of everything that could go wrong. By thinking of all the predators that could attack us. By thinking of all the things never to do again because they cause us pain. You see, the ego has been constantly thinking of everything negative. That's its nature. So we can't blame it or be angry at it, because it's gotten us this far. And it did a very good job, because obviously we're here. So the ego is not something to be defeated or altered in that way. We need to accept and love and heal it. It's actually a scared child in the jungle, right? It is trying to survive in the world. And just because time has made it so that we're not primal anymore, it doesn't know that. It's still coming into the world the exact same way. Where am I? What's going on? Who's that thing? What's that thing? What in the world is that? Everything is a possible threat, okay? And it's only once we do the deep inner work that we transcend that fear. If we look at transcending the ego, we could almost look at it as it is an evolution from moving out of fear and into love. And so we could say that it is, as we evolve, we become less afraid and we become more loving. It's whichever perspective you want to look at. They're both happening simultaneously. As we become more loving and trusting of the universe, we are therefore becoming less afraid of it. Now, some people have liked to focus on one or the other. There are so many different paths to transcendence and inner work. And in yoga, for example, there's so many different paths of yoga. There's many different paths besides asana. Asana being the poses. That is just one form of seeking union or yoga. There are other forms of yoga that are all about giving devotion and focusing on the love of the universe or love of God, whichever you perceive as more useful for you. So this love and devotion helps foster a more positive outlook and therefore pushes away fear. Some people love to address fears head on and say, well, why am I afraid of that? And then break them down that way. Some people like to study, like Jnana Yoga. This is a process of studying and learning the logic as to why we don't need to be afraid. Learning the scriptures, learning the stories of other people. Bhakti being that devotion we just talked about. So you have these different forms of yoga. We have chanting, mantras. These are all ways of trying to transcend the ego and various approaches that work for us. So finding what approach works for you is important. There's karma yoga, which is through service. Some people find that as they give service, they realize that the person I'm serving is me. And we realize that giving service is not for the person receiving, it's actually for the person giving. And this is the same for worship. The worship is not for God, the worship is for ourselves. As we worship, we receive the worship, not God, as we typically externalize this. You see, our duality thinks that as we give to someone, it's the other person who's receiving, but in reality, it's only ourselves. Okay, so transcending these things is a matter of identifying them. Just like we mentioned in the other video, self-awareness, you have to become aware of your belief systems and attachments and emotional triggers in the first place. Emotions are the easiest ones to trigger because they're last on the creation scheme. Belief systems are really hard to get to because you got to work back to them and figure out where in the world they came from. Also, it's interesting tampering with belief systems because they got you where you are now, so they're probably pretty decent. So it's not really about that. It's better to address the emotions first. They're so obvious because by that time they're very bubbling and boiling, right? They want to exude out, right? Think of all the emotions you feel throughout the day. They want to express themselves. Because they want to express themselves, they're easy to spot. Next is then the thoughts. Those are a little difficult, more difficult. Thoughts are sly. And the issue here with thoughts is the ego thinks that I'm thinking. And because it thinks that I'm thinking, the I becomes attached to the thoughts. This is an interesting paradox. The I is not thoughts. Thoughts are just separate. They're impersonal. This is really radical for some people to accept. Thoughts do not belong to anyone. Thoughts do not belong to you. Thoughts just are. They are, like we said, a radio frequency coming through an antenna. Our brain is the antenna, and it's tuned in based on our belief systems. My radio antenna is set to 101, 97, whatever. Okay, so I am receiving all the thoughts in congruence with that frequency. That's not a personal thing though. That's just a product of the antenna being what it is. You wouldn't say that a radio is choosing its frequencies. You just set it to a station and the frequency just came in, right? So you set it to a station and everything that followed after that was not personal. The station didn't choose it, it just was there. Okay, everything emitting on that frequency just came and went, came and went. And this is how it seems that thoughts work. Thoughts are not personal, they do not belong to anyone. If we study and observe them long enough, you'll notice that there's no I behind thoughts. Thoughts arise and then they fall without a me attached to them. This is the goal of meditation, is to realize this, is to realize and just watch thoughts. We sit and watch our thoughts as they come and go. And we let them come and go without attachment. When we do this, we realize that there is a me beyond it. And this is now how we're going to move on to ego as beyond, or a witness, or observer, or a soul. Okay, so as thoughts come in, we realize that there is something beyond them. And how we realize that we are not thoughts is because if we were thoughts, if we were the thoughts, we could not be aware of ourselves. Thoughts would not be aware of their own thoughtness. Let's put it this way. The only reason why you can hear sound is because they're against the background of silence. The only reason why we can hear thoughts is because they're against a background of silence. The only reason why we can see the movie is because it's on the background of a screen. You see what I'm saying? There is something beyond it that allows it to even be observed. And if we were the thoughts and that were the end, then there would be no way to perceive them. Does that make sense? So we must be beyond them, observing them, right? They're coming to us. They're coming in front of us and we're saying, oh, I see and hear this thought. Now, another funny thing to think about thoughts is where are they? Are they like, how do you locate them, right? It's an interesting thing because thoughts kind of just are everywhere. If you really think about it, they don't really have a location to them. It's because they're not in location. Thoughts are in the field. Thoughts are in the infinite radio waves, right? So they're just always, they're everywhere. They have no location. They're, shall we say, ever present. That's why there's this interesting phenomena of people having discoveries on different sides of the planet at the same time, right? A scientist has an epiphany while another epiphany over here, it's the same similar nature. That's because the thought transcended location. And this is also why, you have a thought that someone's going to call you from a distance and they're calling you at that instant. It's because the thought is beyond location. Quantum physics has described how particles and atoms behave this way. They can be in multiple locations at multiple times. There is in the field no sense of location. There is this ability to be ever present. Okay, omnipresent is another way of putting it. All right, so with some time, we start to realize that I am not the thinker. I'm not the body, I'm not the thinker, not the thoughts. I must be beyond them. Again, you see, I just keep pulling away. Okay, I'm not the body, okay. I'm not the thinker, okay. Well, who am I then, right? This is where real self-inquiry begins, as Ramana Maharshi puts it, is figure out who you are. Figure out who is I. Who is the I that you think you are? And if I am not the body and I am not the thinker, then I must be this field, this presence that's observing. Aha, okay. We move into this observer or witness, this consciousness, this sense of awareness that is aware of the following: the thoughts, the emotions, the belief systems, the body, right? The external world and its senses. There's this consciousness that's beyond it, that's able to perceive it all. This consciousness is the same consciousness that perceives dreams. This is why we have perceptions of dreams. Dreams being ultimately diving into the subconscious, or in other words, into the recesses of our minds, our belief systems, and our thought patterns. Again, though, you can think of them as thoughts, and therefore that is why we're able to perceive them. So we've moved now from the body-mind to this observer. What is this observer? This is where the real inquiry begins. This is the process of yoga. We are now trying to find this deeper sense of self that transcends all the others. And this is the real work, because we notice that this observer is truly free of attachment. And the only reason why we can't stay in this state is because we're too attached to the other qualities of the ego that we want to stay there. Does that make sense? So we want to hold on to the fact that we're the thinker. We want to hold on to the fact that I'm this body. I don't know if I'm ready to let go of that. I like this body. You see what I'm saying? We don't know if we want to let it go. Whether the body lives or dies, sick or healthy, beautiful or ugly, or whatever its circumstance is, actually doesn't affect me. I don't know if I'm willing to let go of that. Whether I think really cool, smart thoughts or not is irrelevant. It doesn't really change who I am. I don't know if I'm really ready to let go of that. I like my thoughts. Okay, so this is how things get clingy. This is how attachments form, is we essentially are not letting go of that as an identity. So we therefore are blocking life from flowing because we're like, no, this is me and I'm not willing to let it go. And this is how all of life seems to unfold, is humans are all holding on to identities that are therefore governing all their decisions. And from the perspective of enlightened beings, the message is always that life is full of grandeur and love and there's nothing to fear. That's because they have let go of all their attachments. Therefore, they have nothing to fear. They have nothing to lose, because the illusion of the sense of self is now gone. The illusions of who they are and what is me is vanished, and therefore it has taken away all fear, because all fear comes from, like we said, the unknown and loss. Ultimately, the unknown represents a possible loss, and if it represents loss of self, then I don't want it. Okay, even if the gain is there. Fascinating, right? Again, this made us survive because we couldn't take unnecessary risks. So the ego did this out of, it was pretty clever actually, because it kept it safe. Okay, so with that being said, seeking enlightenment is not a safe thing to do. Because you are going to challenge every sense of security and fear you've ever had, because you're going to face your sense of self. That is the most terrifying thing any of us could ever do, because it means letting go of something we have held on to since the beginning of our life. And in the terms of Buddhism and other religions believing in reincarnation, you've been holding on to it for probably lifetimes. So this is the joy and the fun. Let me tell you this, the silver lining is, from my own experience and countless others, we do notice that as we let go of attachments, life does get better. Happiness becomes easier to come by, and an overall sense of peace, contentment, and love is more accessible. This would make sense even from a logical standpoint. If we look at it from a logical standpoint, the more fears I can release, the happier I'm going to be. So how do I do that? I have to let go of attachments. I have to let go of false sense of self. I have to let go of the ego, in other words. This is why in spiritual and yoga communities, we refer to it as I need to let go of the ego, or I need to transcend the ego. Now, again, let's reiterate as we wrap up. It's not about killing or destroying the ego. The ego is always going to be there, and we must see it with compassion because it got us this far and it's helped us survive over millions of years. Thank you, ego, because otherwise we could not be here. It's to this point, though, as conscious humans, that we now are taking the next step in evolution. It's a conscious evolution, meaning that it is now becoming a choice to evolve. It's less biological and intellectual, and now it is this spiritual evolution. My teacher referred to it as Homo spiritus. It is this next stage in human evolution in that humans consciously let go of limiting sense of self. It is that humans are becoming self-aware. They're becoming fully conscious of who they really are. When a being becomes fully conscious of who they really are, this person is very different than the typical person. That's because they do not have the same neuroses or paranoias or fears or clinging or desires or angers or upsets or any of the basic emotions that you could think of. They do not have the typical highs and lows because they have reached a place of all contentment. This is that omniscience, this omnipotent energy, omnipotent energy. They have reached this point of peace, santosha, contentment. And they do that by understanding the ego for what it is. When they understand the ego for what it is, they thank it with compassion and then they surrender it. Surrender it in that they no longer identify with it. Now, to be clear, to transcend the ego is not to get rid of it. It's not to kill it or destroy it. That's not the point. It's to see it for what it is and no longer identify with it. It's a big difference. That means then that the body and the thinking and all of that may still continue, okay? So thinking is another thing, but the body will continue, okay? So thoughts, most of the time, will slow down. They're going to become less because you stop with attaching to the vanity of them. Ultimately, thinking is a vanity. Ironically, your life would go on perfectly, peacefully without thinking. You would say exactly what you still needed to say in every moment without needing to think about it beforehand. You actually were going to say that anyway. The thought just came a nanosecond later and said, yeah, say that. And then you perceived it as the thought led to the actions. But from an enlightened standpoint, thoughts are not necessary for life to unfold. Now, to transcend the ego then is to let go of attachment to thoughts as me, let go of attachment to body as me. What would that mean? Well, the thoughts, as we said, without attachment would not arise as much and eventually not at all because they will have finally been realized to not be relevant. It's kind of like turning off the radio. You're like, actually, this radio doesn't do anything, so I'm just going to turn it off because it's actually just a needless commentary on life. Thoughts are just a needless commentary. All of life is already unfolding. Now, the body, if we were to get obsessed with destroying the ego as the body, then the body would die. This is what Buddha realized when he became an ascetic and starved himself. And he almost died because he realized he was trying to destroy the ego as body. This is not the path or the truth either, because then you die. It's called suicide. That's a whole other issue. So it's not about destroying anything. That leads to apathy. That leads to a misunderstanding of asceticism, and therefore we wither. And that cannot be the truth. That's not the middle way. That's not the, how could withering and dying be the truth? It doesn't make any sense. So the body is not to be destroyed. The mind is not to be destroyed. They just need to be let go of by seeing them for what they really are. With some contemplation and meditation, we can get into these things. We can really start to see it. I hope that this video has pointed out some good things to think about for you to try on your own. Like I said, don't take my word for it. Start observing it in your own life. Are there certain attachments to your body that have caused you stress? Worrying about what it looks like. Oh my goodness, I remember as a kid, or a teenager especially, oh my gosh, endless stress and worry because every hair needed to be in the right place, or your teeth, or your acne, or your clothing, or whatever, right? It was like so obsessive, and it ruined your day if your clothes didn't match, or whatever. And you see that in adults still, right? This is what I was saying, how a lot of adults are still children. What about your thinking? We get so worried about what we're thinking and what other people are thinking about us. We get so concerned about thoughts. We get so embarrassed about our thoughts, or we worry that somehow they identify us, and so we're always trying to have pride in what we think about. We're trying to portray this, things that we think about, or we're embarrassed about what we do think about. There's a spectrum, right? So in some way it's giving us this anxiety over what we're thinking. And finally, when we release all of that, you can already sense how there's this greater sense of peace when you let go of all these unnecessary worries. They are unnecessary fears. And as we let go of unnecessary fear, we realize true joy that was always there. Truth is like the sun. And all the ego illusions, all these attachments, all these false senses of self are like the clouds. They are blocking the joy of the truth. And it is not that you destroy anything, it's just that you let go of the clouds, let them pass, and suddenly the sun is shining. It's been shining all along, we just couldn't see it. And that is why this path is a path of awakening. It's a path of discovering what was already there and always has been. There's no one at fault here. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing bad about it. We are just realizing the truth. We are realizing that which always was, always will be, and always has been. This is just ever-present, eternal truth. It's always been this way. Find out for yourself, go within, and ask yourself, who am I? Who is the I that I think I am? All right, guys, it's been an absolute pleasure. Namaste. And I hope that this can lend you some food for thought, some guidance on this topic. Hey, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer. It's been a pleasure.